Behind the Wire, an American POW story. Picture this. It's 3 in the morning on a freezing January night in 1945, and in a cramped wooden barracks somewhere in eastern Germany, a young American pilot named Jack Morrison is using a spoon he's been sharpening for 6 months to dig through frozen earth beneath his bunk. Above him, 20 other men sleep restlessly, their breath forming clouds in the sub-zero air. Outside, German guards pace the perimeter with dogs and searchlights, completely unaware that beneath their feet lies a tunnel stretching nearly 200 feet toward the forest beyond the wire. This is Stalag Luft 3, and Jack is one of 76 men about to attempt one of the most audacious escape attempts in military history. But his story, like so many others who found themselves prisoners of war in Nazi Germany, begins months earlier and thousands of feet in the air. The morning of August 17, 1943, started like any other mission briefing at the 8th Air Force Base in England. Jack Morrison, a 23-year-old B-17 pilot from Kansas, sat with his crew in the packed briefing room, smoking cigarettes and trading nervous jokes as they waited to learn their target. When the curtain pulled back to reveal the map, a collective groan filled the room. Schweinfurt. The ball-bearing factories deep in Germany, defended by hundreds of anti-aircraft guns and swarms of Luftwaffe fighters. It would be their longest mission yet, pushing the absolute limits of their fuel capacity, with no fighter escort for most of the journey. Jack's bombardier, a wisecracking kid from Brooklyn named Tommy Rizzo, leaned over and whispered, "Well, this ought to be fun." They had no idea just how right and wrong he was. The mission was a disaster from the start. German fighters hit them in waves before they even reached the target, tearing through the formation like wolves through sheep. Jack watched 3 B-17s from his squadron go down in flames before his own aircraft, which he'd nicknamed Prairie Rose after his girlfriend back home, took a direct hit from an 88mm shell that destroyed the No. 3 engine and sent shrapnel tearing through the fuselage. With the aircraft shuddering and losing altitude, flames spreading along the wing, Jack made the hardest decision of his life. He gave the order to bail out. One by one, his crew jumped into the hostile sky over Germany, their parachutes blossoming white against the smoke-filled air. Jack went last, as captains do, pulling the ripcord at 10,000 feet and watching his beloved bomber spiral earthward in a death spiral of fire and metal. He landed hard in a potato field near a small village, his ankle twisted and his flight suit torn. Before he could even gather his parachute, he was surrounded by German civilians brandishing pitchforks and shotguns, their faces twisted with rage. These were people who'd endured years of Allied bombing, who'd lost homes and loved ones to attacks from the sky, and now one of those terror flyers had literally dropped into their midst. An elderly farmer raised his shotgun, and Jack was certain his war was about to end right there in that field. But then a voice cut through the mob, sharp and commanding in German. A Wehrmacht officer pushed through the crowd, a captain with Iron Cross ribbons and tired eyes who'd clearly seen too much of this war. He placed himself between Jack and the civilians, his hand on his pistol, and in broken English said, "You are prisoner now. You have rights under Geneva Convention. Come." It was the first of many times Jack would discover that the German military, while his enemy, operated under a different code than the Nazi regime they served. The journey to the interrogation center at Stalag Luft near Frankfurt took 3 days by train, during which Jack got his first real look at wartime Germany. Cities reduced to rubble, refugees clogging the roads, and everywhere the sense of a nation straining under the weight of total war. At Stalag Luft, he spent 2 weeks in solitary confinement, while Luftwaffe intelligence officers tried every trick in the book to extract information beyond his name, rank, and serial number. They knew an unsettling amount already, citing his base commander by name, describing the layout of his airfield, even mentioning Prairie Rose's nose art. The interrogator, a smooth-talking major who claimed to have studied at Columbia before the war, would offer cigarettes and coffee, switching between friendly conversation and implicit threats. "We already know everything," he'd say. "Why suffer for information we have? Just confirm a few details, and you'll be on your way to camp with your friends." But Jack, remembering his training, stuck to the script. Morrison, John H., Captain, serial number 0734829. Nothing more. Finally, deemed to have no more intelligence value, Jack was processed and shipped north to his permanent home for the duration, Stalag Luft 3, located near Sagan in what was then eastern Germany. The camp sprawled across acres of sandy soil, surrounded by double fences of barbed wire 12 feet high, with guard towers every 100 yards manned by soldiers with machine guns. The moment Jack marched through the main gate and saw the rows of crude wooden barracks, the thin, hollow-eyed men in ragged uniforms, the monotony of gray earth and gray sky, the reality of his situation hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't a temporary setback. This could be years of his life, assuming he even survived. The war that had seemed so clear and purposeful at 30,000 feet now felt like a distant abstraction. His war now consisted of these fences, these barracks, these guards, and these men. The camp was organized by nationality and rank, with officers separated from enlisted men, and Jack found himself in the North Compound with other Allied airmen, primarily British RAF, but with a growing American contingent as the bombing campaign intensified. His new home was a room in Barracks 104, a space roughly 15 by 20 feet that housed 12 men sleeping on 3-tier wooden bunks with straw mattresses so thin you could feel every board beneath. The room had a small stove that provided almost no heat, a single light bulb that worked when the Germans felt generous with electricity, and windows covered with shutters that the guards could close from outside. The men who greeted him were a mixed bunch. A South African Spitfire pilot shot down over France, a Canadian navigator who'd survived 2 years already, a jovial Australian bombardier who seemed to find humor in everything, and 8 others, each with their own story of how they'd fallen from the sky and ended up here behind the wire. That first night, lying on his bunk and staring at the ceiling, Jack learned the fundamental truth of POW life. Boredom was the real enemy. The actual Germans were just guards doing their job, mostly older men or wounded veterans pulled from frontline duty. Some were cruel, others surprisingly decent, but all were just part of the scenery. The real battle was against time itself, the crushing monotony of days that blurred into weeks that stretched into months. Wake at dawn for Appel, the twice-daily roll call where they'd stand in formation while guards counted and recounted. A meager breakfast of ersatz coffee that tasted like burnt bark and a slice of black bread that seemed to contain more sawdust than grain. Hours of nothing. A watery soup for lunch, more nothing, another roll call, and then lights out. Day after day after day, with the only variation being which guard was in which tower and whether the soup had slightly more potato peelings than usual. But Jack quickly learned that beneath the surface of tedious routine, Stalag Luft 3 was a hive of activity. The senior Allied officers had organized the camp into a shadow military structure, complete with escape committees, intelligence networks, security services, and even a secret radio that somehow received BBC broadcasts, despite the Germans' best efforts to find it. The very first night, Tommy Rizzo, his bombardier who'd ended up in the same compound through sheer luck, pulled him aside and whispered, "We're getting out of here, Jack. There's a tunnel operation going. They call them Tom, Dick, and Harry. I don't know which one I'll be on yet, but I've been told I can help with dispersal. You interested?" Jack didn't even hesitate. He was interested. Escape wasn't just about getting free. It was about having a purpose, about fighting back in the only way available. It was about staying sane. The escape organization at Stalag Luft 3 was remarkable in its sophistication, a testament to what desperate, intelligent men can accomplish with almost no resources. At its head was Roger Bushell, a South African RAF officer with a scarred face and a burning hatred for the Germans who'd shot him down twice. He'd organized the escape attempt with military precision, dividing hundreds of men into specialized teams. There were the diggers who worked in shifts excavating the tunnels, The dispersers who had to somehow hide hundreds of tons of bright yellow sand that came from below the gray topsoil. The carpenters who built trapdoors and shoring. The forgers who created fake documents. The tailors who converted uniforms into civilian clothes. The intelligence officers who mapped guard routines and studied train schedules. Jack, with his engineering background from university, was assigned to the tunnel support team, building the wooden frames that kept tons of earth from crushing the diggers below. The tunnels themselves were marvels of ingenuity and desperation. Each was 30 feet deep to get below the microphones the Germans had buried to detect digging sounds, and they extended over 300 feet to reach beyond the wire and the guards' patrol paths. The entrance to Harry, the tunnel Jack would eventually work on, was hidden beneath a stove in room 23 of Barracks 104. The trap door was so cunningly made that even when Germans searched the room, which they did regularly, they'd walk right over it without suspecting anything. Below that trap door was a vertical shaft descending 30 feet into the earth, with a ladder made from scrounged bedboards. At the bottom was the tunnel itself, barely 2 feet square, lit by fat lamps made from tin cans filled with margarine from Red Cross parcels, with wicks made from twisted cloth. The air was barely breathable, kept circulating by an ingenious ventilation system, using bellows made from kit bags and metal tubing scrounged from every conceivable source. Jack's first time going down into Harry was an experience he'd never forget. Climbing down that shaft in complete darkness, feeling the earth close around him, then crawling on his belly through a tunnel so narrow his shoulders scraped both sides, lit only by the flickering glow of fat lamps that filled the air with greasy smoke. He had to fight down waves of pure panic. This was different from any fear he'd felt in combat. In his aircraft, at least he'd had space, sky, the illusion of control. Here, he was buried alive under 30 feet of German soil, in a tunnel that could collapse at any moment, or flood if they hit an underground spring, or be discovered by guards who'd happily bury them all alive rather than bother with a trial. But when he reached the working face where 2 diggers were laboriously excavating sand and filling wooden boxes that would be hauled back on a jury-rigged railway made from bed slats, when he saw the determination in their blackened faces, he understood. This was hope. This was resistance. This was refusing to be a passive victim of history. The logistics of the escape operation were staggering. They needed civilian clothes for 76 men, which meant the tailor spent months converting uniforms, darkening them with dyes made from beet juice and boot polish, adding collars and lapels to make them look like civilian coats. They needed documents, dozens of different types, work permits, travel permits, identity cards, all with official-looking stamps and signatures. The forgers, working with pens made from nails and ink from crushed pencil lead and berry juice, produced papers so convincing that some would fool German authorities even under close inspection. They needed maps, meticulously copied from atlases in the camp library and memorized by dozens of men who'd be heading in different directions. They needed food for the journey, hoarded from Red Cross parcels over months, compressed and packaged for travel. They needed compasses, made from razor blades magnetized by rubbing them on silk and suspended in water. And they needed something less tangible but equally important. They needed to keep it all secret from the guards and from the ferrets. The ferrets were the Germans' counter-escape specialists, led by a shrewd Feldwebel named Hermann Glemnitz, who seemed to take the prisoners' escape attempts as a personal challenge. These men would show up at random times, poking through barracks with metal rods, pulling up floorboards, measuring room dimensions, counting bedboards, searching for any sign of tunneling or escape preparation. They were good at their job, and they'd already discovered and destroyed 2 previous tunnels before they were complete. The prisoners had their own counterintelligence service, led by a Canadian pilot who'd set up an elaborate warning system. Men stationed at windows with innocent-looking props, a book or a letter, who'd move to specific positions when a ferret entered the compound, signaling to others who'd pass the warning along. Within seconds of a German entering a barracks, every sign of escape activity would vanish. Trapdoors would be sealed, men would be sitting innocently playing cards or reading, and by the time the ferret reached the room he was searching for, there'd be nothing to find. Jack spent 4 months working on Harry, going down into that suffocating darkness several times a week, usually on dispersal duty. They'd fill bags made from long underwear legs with the excavated sand, tie them inside their trousers, and walk around the compound with pins holding the bags closed. When they were certain no guards were watching, they'd pull the pins and release streams of yellow sand that they'd shuffle into the gray topsoil with their feet. Or they'd dump sand into the gardens that prisoners were allowed to cultivate, mixing it into the soil, or they'd scatter it in the attics of barracks. Over months, they dispersed 100 tons of sand, grain by grain, concealing the evidence of the tunnel growing beneath the guards' feet. It was exhausting, dangerous work that required constant vigilance, but it gave Jack something most POWs didn't have: purpose. Camp life, meanwhile, ground on in its peculiar rhythm. The Germans, bound by the Geneva Convention for Officer POWs, provided the minimum required to sustain life: about 1,500 calories a day of bread, potatoes, and watery soup, supplemented by Red Cross parcels that made the difference between survival and starvation. These parcels, sent by American and British relief organizations, contained condensed milk, chocolate, cigarettes, coffee, and canned goods that became both sustenance and currency. A tin of fish could buy a forged document. A chocolate bar could bribe a guard to look the other way. Cigarettes were cash, with complex exchange rates between American Lucky Strikes, British players, and German-issued tobacco. Men who didn't smoke became wealthy traders, and a thriving black market economy emerged behind the wire. The prisoners organized a full cultural life to combat the crushing boredom. They built a theater where men performed plays, Shakespeare and contemporary comedy, with some prisoners becoming remarkably convincing in drag roles as female characters. They organized lectures on every subject imaginable, taught by men who'd been professors, lawyers, doctors, or simply passionate experts in their fields before the war. Jack attended a lecture series on architecture by a captured pilot who'd studied under Frank Lloyd Wright, learned basic German from a language club, and even took a class on poetry from an Oxford-educated navigator who could recite Yeats from memory. They formed orchestras with instruments provided by the Red Cross, though the Germans censored the music, banning anything too martial or patriotic. They published newspapers typed on carefully hoarded paper, filled with news from the secret radio, sports results from improvised competitions, and dry, humored commentary on camp life. They did everything possible to maintain their dignity and their sanity. But beneath it all was hunger, constant gnawing hunger that never quite went away. Jack lost 40 pounds in his first 6 months behind the wire, his uniform hanging off him like a scarecrow. He developed the prisoner's stoop, the slightly hunched posture of men whose bodies had consumed their own muscle mass for fuel. His teeth became loose from vitamin deficiency. His vision dimmed in the eternal gloom of winter barracks with inadequate lighting. He suffered through dysentery, through frostbite in the unheated barracks during the brutal winter of 1943 to 44, through the psychological toll of news from the outside world that suggested the war might drag on for years yet. He watched men break under the strain, going wire-happy, the prisoner term for psychological collapse that led men to pace the warning wire in front of the main fence, sometimes deliberately crossing it so the guards would shoot them and end their suffering. He attended funerals for men who died from malnutrition, from pneumonia, from guards' bullets, and he clung to the tunnel work as a lifeline, as the thing that kept him from going wire-happy himself. In March of 1944, after nearly a year of work, Harry was finally complete. 336 feet of tunnel stretching from Barracks 104 to what they hoped was well beyond the forest's edge. Roger Bushell, who everyone now called Big X, held a meeting of the escape committee and announced the attempt would happen on the next moonless night, March 24th. He'd already selected the order of escapers based on a complex calculation of who had the best chance of success, who'd contributed most to the tunnel, and who had the most vital reasons for escaping. Jack was number 47, which meant he had a decent chance of getting out before dawn exposed the operation. The plan was for escapers to go through at 10-minute intervals, with the first men leaving at 10 p.m., giving them hours to disperse before the morning roll call revealed the escape. The night of March 24th was one of the coldest of the year, with snow on the ground and temperatures well below freezing. For the men preparing to escape, that was almost good news. The guards would be less vigilant, more focused on staying warm than watching for escape attempts. Jack put on every piece of clothing he owned, then his converted civilian suit over top, complete with a forged identity card that declared him to be a French worker named Jean Marchand. He had a small pack with concentrated food, his compass, his maps, and a handful of Reichsmarks. His plan was to head for the Baltic coast and try to stow away on a Swedish ship. Sweden was neutral, and from there he could make his way back to England. At 9:30 p.m., he joined the crowd of men gathering in Barracks 104, and immediately knew something was wrong from the tension in the air. The trap door was open, and men were going down, but not at the planned 10-minute intervals. Word passed back through the crowd in urgent whispers. The tunnel had come up short. Instead of emerging in the forest beyond the patrol path, it had surfaced only a few feet into the tree line, still within sight of the guard tower. Every man who emerged would be completely visible if the guards looked in that direction. They should abort. They should seal the tunnel and try again another night. But Big X made the call. They were going. They'd worked too hard, sacrificed too much, and who knew if they'd ever get another chance. So they went. Jack's turn came around 1 a.m. He climbed down the shaft, crawled through the tunnel that now felt even more suffocating knowing it might end with capture or a bullet, and emerged into the freezing March night among the trees. A controller hidden in the shadows grabbed his arm and whispered, "Guard tower." Wait for the guard to turn away. Jack crouched in the snow, his heart hammering so hard he was certain the guard must hear it, watching the silhouette in the tower scanning left, then right, then left again. The instant the guard looked away, the controller whispered, "Go!" And Jack ran, crouched low, into the deeper forest. He'd made it. He was out. But freedom was an illusion, and it lasted exactly 4 days. Jack made it nearly 100 miles, traveling by night and hiding during the day, before 2 Gestapo officers picked him up at a train station where he'd made the mistake of trying to buy a ticket with money that, unbeknownst to him, was no longer in circulation. The Gestapo, unlike the Wehrmacht, were not bound by any code of military honor. They beat him methodically, asking over and over who'd helped him, where he'd gotten his documents, what route he'd planned to take. When Jack stuck to name, rank, and serial number, they beat him harder. He spent 3 days in a Gestapo cell, certain he was going to be executed, before Wehrmacht officers arrived and demanded custody. There was apparently some tension between the military and the SS over jurisdiction of escaped POWs, and in this case, the Wehrmacht won. He was transported back to Stalag Luft 3, thrown into the cooler, the camp punishment block, for 2 weeks of solitary confinement on bread and water. He considered himself lucky. 50 of the 76 escapers who'd made it out of the tunnel were recaptured, and then the news came that made the blood of every man in the camp run cold. On Hitler's direct order, 50 of the recaptured officers had been executed by the Gestapo, not in combat, not trying to escape again, but murdered in cold blood, shot in the back of the head and cremated, their ashes returned to the camp in urns. Tommy Rizzo was one of them. So was Big X, Roger Bushell. So were 48 others who'd committed no crime under the Geneva Convention except trying to return to their duty. The camp fell into stunned, grief-stricken silence. These murders were a turning point, a moment when everyone understood that the Nazi regime's lawlessness could reach even into a military POW camp, that their status as officers gave them no real protection. The Germans had crossed a line, and everyone knew that when the war ended, there would be a reckoning. The senior British officer organized a memorial service, and every man in the camp attended, standing at attention while a chaplain read the names of the dead and committed their memory to history. After the Great Escape, As it would later be called, security tightened dramatically. The ferrets increased their searches, guard patrols doubled, and the prisoners were warned explicitly that any further escape attempts would result in immediate execution. The tunnel entrances were dynamited, and German engineers brought in ground-penetrating radar to search for any others they'd missed. For a while, the camp fell into a subdued state, men going through the motions of daily life while processing their grief and rage. But gradually, slowly, the resistance resumed. Not major tunnel projects, but smaller acts of defiance, stealing from the guards, sabotaging equipment, maintaining the secret radio, preparing for whatever came next. Because one thing had changed fundamentally. Everyone now understood they were fighting not just to escape, but to survive until the Allies reached them. The autumn of 1944 brought hope and fear in equal measure. The secret radio brought news of Allied advances, the D-Day landings, the breakout from Normandy, Paris liberated, American forces pushing toward the German border. But it also brought news of German V weapons falling on London, of fierce resistance in the Hurtgen forest, of a war that might still take years to finish. Meanwhile, conditions in the camp deteriorated as Germany's resources dwindled. Red Cross parcels became irregular, then rare, then almost non-existent. The meager German rations shrank further. Men who were already emaciated became skeletal. The winter of 1944 to 45 was particularly brutal, with temperatures dropping to 20 below zero and coal for the barracks stoves almost completely unavailable. Men burned their bedboards for warmth, then their furniture, then anything wooden they could find. Several prisoners died of pneumonia and cold-related illnesses. Jack developed frostbite on his toes that would never fully heal. Then, in late January 1945, they heard the sound that changed everything. Artillery fire from the east. The Russians were coming. The front line, which had seemed impossibly distant when Jack first arrived at the camp, was now less than 100 miles away and closing fast. The guards became nervous, then frightened. Some started treating the prisoners better, clearly thinking about how they'd be judged when the Allies arrived. Others became more brutal, as if punishing the prisoners for Germany's impending defeat. And then, on the bitterly cold night of January 27th, the camp commandant called all senior officers together and delivered the news. They were evacuating the camp immediately. The prisoners would march west, away from the advancing Red Army, to camps in the German interior. They had 2 hours to prepare. What followed was the forced march that survivors would later call the Long March or the Death March, though officially it had no name. 10,000 men from Stalag Luft 3 and other nearby camps, already weakened by years of malnutrition and disease, were ordered to march through a savage winter storm with minimal food and shelter. Jack stuffed everything he could carry into a pack made from a blanket. His remaining food, extra clothing, his blanket itself wrapped around his shoulders. At midnight, the gates opened, and the columns began trudging out into the blizzard. The temperature was 15 below zero, with wind driving snow so thick you could barely see the man ahead of you. The guards, just as cold and miserable, pushed them forward relentlessly. They marched all night, then all the next day, covering nearly 20 miles before the Germans allowed them to stop in a barn, where they collapsed onto the frozen ground and slept in piles for warmth. The next day they marched again, then stopped at another barn, then marched again. Men began falling behind, too weak or sick to continue. Most were picked up by wagons following the column, but some simply disappeared, and Jack never knew if they'd been shot, had died of exposure, or had managed to escape. After 5 days and 60 miles, they reached a train station where they were packed into boxcars, 60 men in cars designed for 40, and transported to other camps throughout Germany. Jack ended up at Stalag 7A in Moosburg, even more crowded and desperate than Luft 3 had been. with prisoners from 24 nations all jammed together as Germany collapsed around them. The final months of the war were a surreal combination of hope and terror. The Allied bombing campaign intensified, with American B-17 and B-24s flying over daily, sometimes bombing so close that shrapnel fell into the camp. Jack would watch them pass overhead, those same aircraft he'd once piloted, and feel a complex mixture of pride, longing, and fear. The guards became increasingly demoralized and unpredictable. Some stopped caring about their duties entirely, while others became paranoid and trigger-happy. Food essentially ceased arriving. The prisoners survived on what they could steal or scrounge. Sanitation collapsed, disease spread, and the death rate climbed. Men who'd survived years of captivity died in those final weeks from typhus, dysentery, or simply starvation. And then, on April 29th, 1945, Jack heard a sound he'd been dreaming about for nearly 2 years. American voices speaking English without a foreign accent. He rushed to the fence and saw them. Sherman tanks rolling down the road toward the camp, soldiers in American uniforms, a flag he hadn't seen since England. General Patton's Third Army had reached Moosburg. The guards put down their weapons and melted away, and the gates swung open. American soldiers walked into the camp, and the sight that greeted them shocked even these combat veterans. 30,000 living skeletons in rags, many too weak to walk, all cheering and weeping with joy. Jack found himself shaking hands with a young lieutenant who couldn't have been more than 20, who looked at him with something like horror and kept saying, "You're going home, sir. You're all going home now." But going home wasn't instantaneous. It took weeks to process all the liberated prisoners, to provide medical treatment to those most desperately ill, to arrange transport to France, and then to Britain, and finally to the United States. Jack spent 3 weeks in a hospital gaining weight and strength before he was cleared for travel. He flew back to England on a C-47, the first time he'd been in an aircraft in almost 2 years, and spent another week at a debriefing center where intelligence officers wanted to know everything about his captivity, the camp organization, the guards, the escape attempts. They were already building the case for war crimes trials. Finally, in June 1945, Jack boarded a ship in Southampton bound for New York. He stood at the rail as they pulled away from England, watching the white cliffs of Dover recede, and felt nothing. He'd expected some great emotional release, some feeling of triumph or joy, but there was only a hollow numbness. The war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered. But Tommy Rizzo was still dead, along with 50 other good men who'd been murdered for the crime of trying to escape. Jack's youth was gone, burned away in the fires over Germany, and buried in the frozen ground of Stalag Luft III. The man who'd climbed into Prairie Rose on that August morning in 1943, full of righteous certainty and simple patriotism, no longer existed. The ship docked in New York on a bright June morning, and Jack walked down the gangplank into crowds of cheering civilians, bands playing, confetti falling like snow. He was a hero, a returned warrior, a symbol of American courage and sacrifice. People wanted to shake his hand, to hear his story, to celebrate his survival. But Jack felt like a fraud. He hadn't won any great victories. He'd been shot down on his first combat mission, spent 2 years eating soup and digging tunnels, and survived through luck more than skill. The real heroes in his mind were the men like Tommy who hadn't come home at all. The train ride back to Kansas gave him time to think about what he'd tell people, how he'd explain the years behind the wire. But when he finally walked into his family's house and saw his mother's face, saw his father trying not to cry, saw his kid brother who'd grown 6 inches and wasn't a kid anymore, he realized he didn't need to explain anything. They didn't really want to know, not the truth of it. They wanted to know that he was home and safe and that life could go back to normal. So he told them it hadn't been so bad, that the Germans had treated them okay, that he'd made good friends and even learned some things. He didn't mention the hunger or the cold or the men dying around him. He definitely didn't mention the 50 murdered officers. That would just upset everyone. And what good would it do? Jack spent the summer of 1945 in a strange limbo, officially on leave but not yet discharged, as the Army decided what to do with pilots who were no longer needed now that the war was over. He'd sit on the porch of his parents' house, watching the wheat fields turn gold in the Kansas sun, and feel like a ghost haunting his own life. His girlfriend had married someone else while he was gone, which he couldn't even blame her for. She thought he was dead for over a year before learning he was a prisoner. His friends who'd stayed home were working jobs, starting families, getting on with their lives. The ones who'd gone to war and survived had their own ghosts and weren't much interested in talking about it. Everyone just wanted to forget, to move on, to embrace the peace they'd fought so hard to win. In September, Jack received his discharge papers and his final pay, along with a chest full of medals he'd never asked for. The Purple Heart, the Air Medal, the Distinguished Flying Cross, the POW Medal. He put them in a box in the back of his closet and tried to figure out what came next. The GI Bill would pay for him to finish his engineering degree, so he enrolled at Kansas State and threw himself into studying, grateful for something to focus on besides the memories that still woke him in cold sweats most nights. He graduated in 1948, married a kind woman who never pushed him to talk about the war, and took a job designing commercial buildings in Denver. He had 3 children, bought a house in the suburbs, and lived what would look to any outside observer like a perfectly normal, successful American life. But the war never really left him. In quiet moments, he'd find himself calculating how far it was to the nearest fence, what route he'd take if he needed to escape. He couldn't stand to be in small spaces, would have panic attacks in elevators or closets. He'd wake up thinking he heard German voices, guards walking the perimeter of a camp that no longer existed. He'd see a man in the grocery store who moved like one of the ferrets and have to leave immediately. Every March 24th, he'd take the day off work and sit alone, remembering Tommy Rizzo and the others who died trying to be free. It wasn't until the 1960s, when his youngest son asked about his war experience for a school project, that Jack finally started talking about it. And once he started, he found he couldn't stop. All those years of memories came pouring out. The good men he'd known, the impossible conditions they'd endured, the incredible ingenuity of the escape attempts, the grinding boredom punctuated by moments of terror, and yes, the murders of 50 officers that still haunted his dreams. His son wrote his report, but more importantly, Jack discovered that talking about it helped. The memories didn't hurt quite as much when they were spoken aloud, acknowledged, shared. Over the years, Jack became involved with POW organizations, attending reunions and memorial services. He traveled back to Germany in 1975, visiting the site of Stalag Luft 3, which was now in Poland after the border changes following the war. The camp itself was mostly gone, demolished by the Soviets, but there was a memorial to the 50 executed officers. Jack stood before it, reading the names, and wept for the first time since the war ended. He'd been so busy surviving, then so busy forgetting, that he'd never properly grieved. But now, standing on that sandy German soil where he'd spent 2 years of his youth, he finally let himself feel the full weight of what had been lost. Jack Morrison died in 2003 at the age of 83, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. At his funeral, his oldest son read from a memoir Jack had finally written in his retirement, urged by his family to record his story before it was lost. The final passage captured something essential about the POW experience. People often call us heroes, but we weren't heroes. We were just men who got shot down and tried to make the best of a terrible situation. The real heroism was in the small things. Sharing your last piece of bread with a friend who was hungrier than you, keeping your sense of humor when everything was hopeless, maintaining your dignity when they tried to strip it away, refusing to give up even when giving up was the most logical thing to do. Every man who survived the camps was a hero in those small ways. Every man who didn't survive was a hero just for trying. That's what I want people to remember. Not the tunnels or the escapes, impressive as those were, but the quiet daily courage it took just to remain human in a place designed to break you. The story of American POWs in German camps is ultimately a story about resilience, about the indomitable human spirit's refusal to be crushed even under the most brutal circumstances. It's about young men, most barely out of their teens, who found themselves thrust into a nightmare of captivity thousands of miles from home, and who fought back in the only ways available to them, through solidarity, through ingenuity, through stubborn refusal to let their captors define who they were. The tunnels they dug weren't just attempts at physical escape. They were acts of psychological resistance, ways of asserting that they were still soldiers, still at war, still capable of fighting even behind barbed wire. What makes the POW experience particularly poignant is how it inverted everything these men had trained for. They'd been taught to fly, to fight, to dominate the sky. Then suddenly they were grounded, powerless, reduced to the most basic struggle for survival. The skills that had made them elite warriors became useless. Instead, they had to develop entirely new capabilities: patience, cunning, the ability to endure monotony, the psychological strength to maintain hope year after year with no certainty of ever seeing home again. Some men thrived in this environment, discovering reserves of character they hadn't known they possessed. Others broke under the strain, and there was no shame in that because the strain was inhuman. The camps themselves were studies in contradiction. On paper, governed by the Geneva Convention, they were supposed to provide humane treatment, adequate food, shelter, medical care, opportunities for recreation, and correspondence with home. In reality, they were pressure cookers of deprivation, boredom, and existential dread. The Germans, struggling to feed their own population as the Allied blockade tightened and their territory shrank, had little to spare for prisoners. The guards were often decent men just doing a job they hadn't asked for, but they were also representatives of a regime that had revealed itself capable of monstrous evil, as the murder of the 50 escapers proved beyond doubt. For the prisoners, every interaction with their captors was colored by this ambiguity. Treat them as fellow soldiers following the rules of war, or as enablers of atrocity. The class and nationality divisions within the camps added another layer of complexity. Officers were separated from enlisted men, which meant the officers often had better conditions but also carried the burden of maintaining morale and discipline without any real authority beyond moral suasion. British, American, Canadian, Australian, South African, and other Allied prisoners all brought their own cultural expectations and coping mechanisms. The British, with their long tradition of keeping calm and carrying on, organized elaborate social hierarchies and ritual. The Americans, more informal and individualistic, sometimes chafed under this structure but also brought their own strengths: mechanical ingenuity, entrepreneurial spirit, and an unshakable confidence that they'd ultimately win. Together, they created a unique hybrid culture behind the wire, a miniature international community united by their common enemy and their common suffering. Food, or the lack of it, dominated prisoner consciousness in ways that people who've never been truly hungry can hardly imagine. Every waking moment was colored by hunger. Every conversation eventually turned to food. Every dream featured elaborate feasts. Men would spend hours discussing in meticulous detail the meals they'd eat when they got home, recipes they'd cook, restaurants they'd visit. They'd save and trade scraps of food with the calculation of Wall Street traders, because in a world where you're slowly starving, a tin of condensed milk or a bar of chocolate isn't just sustenance. It's wealth, power, and hope concentrated in a small package. The Red Cross parcels weren't just appreciated, they were worshipped. And when they stopped coming in the war's final months, the psychological impact was almost as devastating as the physical deprivation. The secret radio deserves special mention as one of the prisoners' greatest achievements and most vital morale tools. Despite German threats of execution for anyone caught with a radio, despite regular searches and sophisticated detection equipment, the prisoners managed to maintain a working receiver throughout most of the war. It was hidden in different locations, moved frequently, operated only by trusted men who knew how to avoid detection. The news it brought was carefully vetted and distributed through chain-of-command channels to avoid spreading panic or false hope. When the Allies were winning, as they increasingly were after 1943, the radio brought validation that their sacrifice meant something, that the war was being won, that liberation would eventually come. When the news was bad, the radio operators would sometimes sanitize it, shading the truth to maintain morale. This wasn't dishonesty, it was psychological warfare against despair. The guards themselves were a varied lot, and the prisoners became expert at reading their personalities and exploiting their weaknesses. There was the ferret Glemnitz, respected by prisoners for his professionalism, even as they worked constantly to outsmart him. There were brutal guards who seemed to enjoy their power over the prisoners and would hand out beatings for minor infractions. There were indifferent guards who just wanted to survive the war and go home, who could sometimes be bribed or befriended. There were older guards, veterans of the First World War, who treated the prisoners with a certain weary sympathy, understanding that they too had once been young men caught up in forces beyond their control. And there were the true believers, the Nazi fanatics who saw the prisoners as subhuman enemies to be degraded at every opportunity. Learning to distinguish between these types and interact with each appropriately was a survival skill. The psychological toll of captivity manifested in countless ways. Men developed obsessive routines, performing the same meaningless tasks at the same time each day, because routine provided an illusion of control. They'd pace the compound in endless circles, walking miles to nowhere. They'd count things compulsively, steps taken, planks in the barracks walls, days since capture, days until some imagined liberation date. They'd create elaborate fantasy lives, entire imaginary existences in the world beyond the wire where they were successful, happy, free. Some men retreated into books, reading and rereading the limited library stock until they could recite entire novels from memory. Others threw themselves into camp activities, theater, sports, study groups, anything to fill the yawning emptiness of time. The news of the 50 murders was a watershed moment that changed the fundamental nature of captivity. Before that, there had been an unspoken understanding that both sides were playing by certain rules. The Germans might be harsh, conditions might be terrible, but officer POWs were theoretically protected by international law. The murders shattered that illusion. If the Gestapo could execute 50 unarmed prisoners in cold blood, then no one was safe. The camp's mood shifted from frustration and boredom to genuine fear. Men who'd been planning escapes reconsidered, not out of cowardice, but from the rational calculation that escape now carried not just the risk of recapture, but of execution. The Germans had meant the murders as a deterrent, and in that narrow sense they succeeded. But they also created a permanent record of Nazi criminality that would be used against them at Nuremberg and in countless war crimes trials. The Long March in January 1945 was perhaps the cruelest chapter of the whole POW experience because it came so close to the end, when liberation seemed imminent. Men who'd survived years of captivity died on those frozen roads from exposure, exhaustion, or guards' bullets. The march served no military purpose. The Germans could have simply left the prisoners for the Soviets to liberate. But Nazi ideology couldn't tolerate that outcome, couldn't allow thousands of Allied prisoners to fall into Soviet hands where they might be well treated and used for propaganda. So they marched them west through a blizzard, and men died pointlessly in those final months of a war Germany had already lost. The liberation itself was anticlimactic for many prisoners. They'd dreamed of it for so long, built it up in their imaginations as some transcendent moment of joy and vindication. But when it finally came, they were too exhausted, too sick, too psychologically damaged to fully process it. The first American soldiers who entered the camps were shocked by what they found. Men who looked like concentration camp victims, skeletal figures in rags, many too weak to walk. These were fellow Americans, officers and airmen, but they barely looked human anymore. The liberators did their best. providing food and medical care. But many prisoners died even after liberation, their bodies too damaged to recover. And those who did survive faced the long, difficult process of reintegration into a world that had moved on without them. The homecoming was complicated by the fact that few people really wanted to hear the truth about the camps. This was a war America had won decisively, a good war against evil, and there wasn't much room in that narrative for stories about American suffering and German atrocities against white Christian POWs. The Holocaust was beginning to be understood in its full horror, and compared to that, the POW experience seemed almost benign. So the returning prisoners often found it easier to minimize their suffering, to tell sanitized versions of their stories, to just try to forget and move on. It would be decades before many of them could fully process what they'd been through, before PTSD was even recognized as a condition rather than a character flaw. The legacy of the American POWs in German camps is preserved in memorials, in museums, in the few surviving structures at campsites, and in the stories passed down through families. The Great Escape from Stalag Luft III became the most famous POW story, immortalized in a Hollywood film that took considerable liberties with the truth, but captured something essential about the spirit of resistance. Less well known but equally remarkable were the countless smaller acts of defiance, the secret schools where men taught each other skills for post-war life, the theatrical productions that maintained culture and beauty in the midst of deprivation, the elaborate trading networks that redistributed resources from those with excess to those in desperate need, the quiet acts of kindness between prisoners that maintained their humanity. What comes through in all the memoirs and oral histories is the importance of community. Men survived not primarily through physical strength or individual cunning, but through the bonds they formed with fellow prisoners. Your roommates became your family, closer in some ways than biological family because they shared your suffering in a way no one else could. You pooled resources, looked out for each other, covered for each other during escape activities, nursed each other through illness, and kept each other sane through the long months of monotony. These bonds often lasted a lifetime, with former roommates maintaining correspondence decades after the war, attending reunions, serving as pallbearers at each other's funerals. They'd been through something together that no one else could fully understand. The question of how captivity changed these men is difficult to answer because it varied so dramatically between individuals. Some, like Jack Morrison, carried psychological scars for the rest of their lives, struggling with claustrophobia, hypervigilance, nightmares, and difficulty trusting authority. Others seemed to emerge relatively unscathed, or at least became adept at hiding their damage. Some found that the experience had taught them resilience and perspective, that having survived the camps, they could survive anything. They'd learned what truly mattered in life, what was worth fighting for, and what was just trivial nonsense. They'd learned that human beings are capable of both remarkable evil and remarkable nobility, sometimes in the same person. They'd learned that survival isn't just about physical endurance, but about maintaining your sense of self, your values, your humanity in circumstances designed to strip all of that away. The story of these men deserves to be remembered not as a footnote to the greater conflict, but as a testament to a particular kind of courage. The courage to endure. The courage to resist in small, persistent ways when large-scale resistance was impossible. The courage to maintain hope when hope seemed irrational. The courage to hold on to your identity as a soldier, as an American, as a human being, when everything conspired to reduce you to a starving animal concerned only with survival. These weren't the warriors of propaganda posters, striking heroic poses and winning glorious victories. They were young men who'd been shot down, captured, and imprisoned, who spent years in limbo while the war raged on without them, who came home damaged in ways both visible and invisible. But they were heroes nonetheless, heroes in the truest sense, because they refused to surrender their humanity even when everything was taken from them. That refusal, multiplied across thousands of prisoners in dozens of camps, is what this story is really about. Not escape tunnels or clever schemes, though those are impressive, but the fundamental human drive to remain free in spirit even when imprisoned body, to fight even when fighting seems pointless, to hope even when hope seems foolish. That's the legacy of the American POWs in German stalags and oflags, and that's why their story still resonates 80 years later.